All right, welcome back to the My Sugar Free Journey podcast. I am your host, Aaron Farmer, and today we are joined by Siobhan Huggins. So Siobhan been on a ketogenic diet for over 2 years, a year of which has been full-blown carnivore. During this time, she's lost 80 pounds, reversed her hypertension, and stopped her blood sugars from going out of control. After meeting Dave Feldman at Keto Fest 2017, Siobhan's passion for lipidology was ignited, and she was driven to research all she could in a mad attempt to figure out how lipids were involved in the immune system and chronic diseases. She has since joined forces with Dave Feldman full-time, leaving her job in IT to dedicate herself to decoding the mysteries of cholesterol. During this time, she's undertaken some self-experimentation of her own, shedding some light on one of the more mysterious lipid markers, lipoprotein A. So, Siobhan, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you. And this is actually our first podcast, hopefully, if we get through it, with my wife, Diane, as a co-host. So, Diane, say hello.
Hello, everyone.
So hopefully this doesn't turn out to be a train wreck. So, Siobhan, I am absolutely fascinated by the work that you and Dave Feldman are doing. I think that it's impressive. In fact, Dave Feldman, I was looking back because I knew he was on one of our previous podcasts. He was on a podcast like the third or fourth episode of this podcast, 2 or 3 years ago. Just really interesting work. How, I guess let's get into your story specifically. You said you met him at Keto Fest 2017. How did you find keto as a way to eat, and what kind of started you? What was going on before you met Dave?
So mostly what was going on was like a year before that, I had been really, really overweight. Like 240 pounds was my highest weight. I was about 221 when I started keto. And the way that I found it was I had actually told my mom that I wanted to try and lose weight through calorie restriction, which I had tried several times before and nothing had ever come of it except really bad mood swings. And she essentially said, instead of trying that, why don't you try this thing that I've been reading up on, which was keto, and she handed me a magazine article about it. And she said that she had been thinking of trying it, and she wanted to essentially try it together. I wasn't too impressed with the article. I think it was from like Dr. Oz or something like that, like some TV personality. But I essentially took the information and looked it up online and found that there did seem to be scientific backing behind it actually working. So I knew that Mom wasn't dumb or anything. She's very intelligent. So I figured it must have like some reason for why she would pick it. So I decided to go ahead and try out full keto for 2 full months. And if it didn't work, I would be no worse off.
Right.
And by the end of those 2 months, I had lost about 20 pounds. So I was like, well, I guess I'm sticking with this forever now.
And what year was that?
That would have been, I think it was like August of 2016.
Okay. So how, I guess, what was your background in lipidology before Keto Fest, before you meeting Dave? How did, I guess I'm not sure, because most people do keto and don't care anything about lipidology. How did you get there?
So my background is very easy to sum up. I had none, no experience. Okay. I think I had maybe seen one of Dave's talks, like the Breckenridge talk maybe, but even then it was like, okay, watch it. That's interesting. Done. And he would pop up occasionally in the admin chat that we have for the admins of the ketogenic forums, which is run by the 2 keto dudes. So I would see him in passing occasionally. But for some reason, when I met him at Keto Fest, it was just like, boom, I was entranced. I think it was because he described the lipid system as a distributed object network or something similar to it, which is like computer terms. Oh, I get that. So if I understand computers, maybe I can understand this. And he brought up a couple questions that he didn't have answers to at the time. And essentially was just throwing them at me as we were having more and more conversations over the conference. And one of them was, what if LDL is oxidized before it gets into the arteries? And what if that is maybe intentional? Maybe that's part of the reasons it's there for. And then one of them was also, what if plaque is protective? And he threw those at me, And I'm the type of person who can't let questions like that go. Like, I already knew he was busy.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, if
Right.
I leave this up to him to figure it out, then I'm going to be waiting for a long time. And he also was just very interesting as a person in general. So I had actually come back from Keto Fest and talked to a coworker of mine and had said, there's this guy, Dave Feldman, and I really want to help him with his research. I don't know how, but I'm going to do it. And so here I am.
Fantastic. Fantastic. So I guess before I get into some of the specific things you've been looking at for the last 2 years, let's just start with cholesterol in general terms. What are some of the things, or what are the big things that you and Dave have discovered about cholesterol and blood lipids in general that maybe wasn't common knowledge before you guys started this? What is cholesterol? Let's start there.
Okay, so cholesterol is essentially a fatty substance, and because of that, it can't go through the bloodstream on its own because your blood is actually water-based. So trying to mix something that's fat-based with water doesn't usually work out too well. So what the body does is it packages up in particles. And it's also packaged up with other fatty substances that we need, like triglycerides, which are energy, fat-based energy, and then fat-soluble vitamins, sometimes hormones, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that way it can travel through the bloodstream without clumping up and getting all weird. And the particles that carry them would be an LDL particle, a VLDL particle, a chylomicron, and all of those are just lipoproteins. It's just different types of lipoproteins. So cholesterol is actually used for quite a few different things. We can make hormones out of it. We can also, cell membranes are made out of phospholipid and cholesterol, so they can use cholesterol to repair themselves. And cholesterol makes up most of the brain. I mean, a lot of the brain. So yeah, it's actually quite useful in a lot of different ways. And I think one of the things that I pretty much never saw talked about before I started researching it with Dave was LDL particles, the ones carrying the LDL cholesterol, which is what everybody freaks out about. They actually have a really important role in the immune system. So if you think about it, if you look at like a result and you say, okay, this person has 1,000 particles from NMR lipoprofile, which is how you figure that out, then it doesn't sound like very many because you have a whole ton of blood, a whole ton of arteries just to go through. So it doesn't sound like very much. But if you actually do the math for what that actually means, it's more like LDL particles are in the quintillions. So it's just this huge, huge force. And one thing that Dave actually mentioned to me back at Keto Fest was that LDL particles can bind to pathogens. So they can bind to them, and in the process of doing that, they can essentially make immune cells aware that they are now carrying a pathogen, and the immune cell will eat them, kill the pathogen, and now that's one pathogen that we don't have to worry about. And we have quintillions of these guys. So just the huge force of these guys in the system, just the huge impact on a passive barrier against infection is, like, I'm surprised people don't talk about this more because it's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, most people don't think of cholesterol as being part of the immune system. We think, white blood cells and, that there's things like that.
And I guess you could argue whether the cholesterol is a part of it or not, but regardless, if the cholesterol is in your system, it's being carried by one of these particles, and the particles, it's been acknowledged in the literature. Some have even argued that they should be added, LDL particles should be mentioned in immunology textbooks because this is a part of the innate immune system.
So are there correlations between having low cholesterol or even low LDL cholesterol and increased rates of disease?
Yeah. If you look at, for example, for people who have higher mortality with lower cholesterol, pretty much every single time if you look through the study at what they're dying more from, it's usually things like cancer and infection. And infection is one of the bigger ones. And there are papers talking about how if you come into the hospital with lower cholesterol, for say a surgery, you're more likely to die of infection and like all this type of stuff. So it does seem to be, even in real world terms, a factor that needs to be considered.
Well, how did we get get it so wrong? Why weren't we seeing these correlations for the last 50 years? And instead, cholesterol has been demonized. Because, when you talk to somebody about their health, cholesterol is almost cholesterol is their health. Hey, how are you doing? Well, the doctor said my cholesterol is low. How did that idea get to be so prevalent, and how did we get it so wrong? Was this science did this science just not exist 50 years ago, or what happened there?
Well, if you actually dig through the research, there are papers that talk about this from quite a while ago. But the issue is that the prevalent idea was that high cholesterol causes heart disease, and heart disease was one of the leading causes of death. So it's like, hey, if we lower this, sure, we can maybe die more of infection if they acknowledge that. But on the other hand, if we could really get this rate of heart disease down, that's kind of what we care about. And for sure, there is a weak correlation of LDL cholesterol with heart disease, but how well that holds up for checking against having high HDL and low triglycerides, for example, I mean, the evidence I've seen so far hasn't been convincing. If you look at people with high HDL, low triglycerides, but also high LDL, the rates of heart disease, at least from Framingham offspring data, for example, it's not much of an increased risk, if any. So, I mean, why they weren't looking at that, since high HDL and low triglycerides is kind of a known risk factor, I don't know. But it's something that I've been looking for. It's something that Dave has been looking for too, because that's actually a profile we see quite often in the low-carb community, is these people with really high HDL, really low triglycerides, and really high LDL in a lot of cases. And the question now is that something to be concerned about? And for right now, we don't know, but I am optimistic so far from the evidence that I've seen.
Well, I know Dave's got a bounty on the LDL and what needs to happen there. So I definitely want to talk to you about that. But this idea that cholesterol is protective against disease is something that I don't think gets talked about enough. But I want to also talk about the role of cholesterol in heart disease, just because you brought it up, because that's the boogeyman, right? That's the big boogeyman that everyone thinks is going to get you. You're going to eat red meat. It's going to, blow your cholesterol up, and, your heart's going to pop out of your chest. What is it about a low-carb diet that changes your cholesterol markers, and how do we know that these changed cholesterol markers on a low-carb diet are protective against heart disease, or at least don't cause heart disease?
Well, to answer up front, we don't know yet. We're trying to find out. But it seems, at least the leading hypothesis that we have now, is that it's based on energy needs. Because like I said before, these particles are carrying cholesterol, yes, but they're also carrying triglycerides. And triglycerides for your cells, it's energy packed. It's fantastic, fantastic energy to use, especially if you're on a high-fat diet. It's that or starve. So we need to get them there somehow. And the way that we can do that, if we're running off of body fat stores in between meals, for example, is to ship them out in these particles called VLDL. And once the VLDL has dropped off those triglycerides, a lot of the time it'll be remodeled into LDL. So the current thinking is that the LDL is higher because we're using more of those VLDL, so it's a downstream effect. Now, the thing is that we don't know that for sure. There are possible ways of figuring out if that's true, but it's the best idea I have for right now, and it makes sense, and it's established in the literature that we do this, and we can even see for extended fasts, for example, that LDL will go up, VLDL will go up, so we can see it happening. And there's even a recent paper released by Volek and Finney, I think, who are looking at low-carb athletes, and they had this profile compared to high-carb athletes. They had this energy profile of using fat-based energy more than someone would on a high-carb diet. So if that's all it is it harmful? Again, don't know, but the research does leave me optimistic so far that the profile that we're seeing, which is, again, high HDL. HDL is one of our inflammation markers. So if you're experiencing some sort of event that's leaving you inflamed, often HDL will be low, sometimes very, very low. We don't see that typically in low carbers unless something else is going on. Triglycerides also low. When there's inflammation or insulin resistance going on, typically that tends to be very high. Again, don't typically see that with low carbers, although I've seen a few. And LDL tends to be high, possibly because of the energy thing. So that's the kind of profile that we're looking at. And yeah, if you look at that coupled together, it looks possibly low risk. We could find data that goes against that, but not so far.
So I want to bring Diane in here for a minute. I've got a microphone muted because we had some audio issues, but oops, let me do like this. I want to Diane to ask a few questions about cholesterol and women. Are there specific things that women need to know about? So let me unmute her.
Well, one of the things that I was thinking about was, like you were talking about, cholesterol has been demonized. I mean, that's the number one thing that you hear. Like you said, cholesterol is the be-all to the end-all of your health. So, but honestly, a layperson like me would think more about my husband's cholesterol than my cholesterol. I don't feel like we as women think much about our cholesterol. I don't know that the doctors even really focus on that for me ever. They talk about other things, but the cholesterol is just kind of like a side thing. So do we have the same, do we process it the same way? Do we have the same, as men, the same kind of possibilities of dangers in our in our lives? I'm not saying the right word, in our health, or is it a whole different thing for women?
Yeah, so this is actually something I found pretty interesting because while searching for all this cholesterol research, I kept, interestingly, coming across papers that were talking about high risk of LDL in women, and the conclusions they were coming to was LDL wasn't very predictive in women. And I actually just started keeping a list every single time it was mentioned. And I have a post up about this on cholesterolcode.com, but there are a lot of papers from all over the world talking about LDL risk in regards to women. And from the times that I've seen regarding heart disease risk, all-cause mortality, ischemic heart disease, it doesn't correlate very well. Now, there's some speculation as to why that is. Some researchers have said that estrogen is more protective against heart disease or something like that is going on. I've also seen it speculated that women tend to get insulin resistance much later in life, so they may have some protection against heart disease because of that. I haven't seen a conclusive reason yet, but I mean, the studies say over and over again, it's just the same thing. High LDL doesn't appear to correlate. Sometimes I'll see it mentioned that low levels of LDL correlate with higher risk of all-cause mortality in women, for example. But it's pretty much just an inverse relation. The higher the cholesterol goes, the lower the all-cause mortality for women. But there are other markers that are more helpful for women. There's the atherogenic index of plasma, which is working off of HDL and triglycerides. There's also the triglyceride to HDL ratio. Both of those seem to still hold pretty strong as far as all-cause mortality and even heart disease risk and stuff like that. And we actually have a calculator on cholesterol code where you can input your numbers and it'll give you the atherogenic index of plasma. So I usually just go with that for myself along with other markers.
It's funny, I was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes several years ago, lost a lot of weight, got rid of that. But that was when they started talking about cholesterol, triglycerides, and all that stuff. Before that, no one had ever mentioned anything. They didn't, it just wasn't important. Now that they decided that I had diabetes, and now they can't decide why I don't show that anymore. So they keep kind of thinking that I still have it, but I'm not on anything for it. But they still want to discuss the cholesterol. And that was something that was never, ever discussed before they decided that I was type 2 diabetic, which I felt was kind of funny.
Yeah, that's not actually surprising because one of the things with diabetes is that there's a huge increase in the risk of heart disease. So it's not surprising that they started looking at other risk factors for heart disease as soon as you were diagnosed, because now that's on their radar. When typically for women, it's not. Usually, I don't think they look at it very closely. But again, that's not surprising because, as Ira Cummins has talked about, insulin resistance and heart disease kind of go hand in hand, along with a bunch of other problems. So, yeah, not surprising.
Yeah, that correlation between diabetes and heart disease is so strong. So you would think that anything that would lower risk of type 2 diabetes would also lower. I mean, in the doctor's mind, that would be a correlation between lowering the risk of type 2 diabetes and lowering the risk of heart disease. And as more and more of this information comes out that a low-carb diet will reverse type 2 diabetes, you would think that they would make that next jump and say, well, this will probably also correlate with lower risk of heart disease. And we're just not seeing in my... hold on. Go ahead.
I don't think that they believe that a low-carb diet can help you get rid of type 2 diabetes, because they still won't admit that I don't have it, even though I lost all the weight and I don't have to do anything. You know, they check my blood sugar and they're like, you're fine, but they still want to say stuff about type 2 diabetes, and it's been like 7 years.
Exactly. Yeah, so in defense of doctors, they have to work off of the guidelines. They don't have a choice, or they're risking their jobs. And these are people with families too, and really all they really want is to help their patients. And in following the guidelines, that's probably what they think they're doing, is helping people. So as far as low-carb reversing diabetes, we do have some stuff out, but it's not to the point where it's affecting the guidelines. So even if they did go for that, and there are some doctors who do, they are doing that at a risk of their career, where if anything happens after they suggested a low-carb diet, they could be facing a lawsuit. They could be facing loss of their medical license, like all this type of stuff. So I do feel for the doctors, because it's a really, really difficult position to be in. Even, for example, for statins, if they had read the research and come to their own conclusions that it's not helpful for primary prevention or not especially effective or whatever they think, even if they think that, they can't go around saying, oh, you don't need them, because according to the guidelines, if you have high cholesterol, you're at risk, and they need to bring it up one way or the other. So it's not an easy position to be in for them. I mean, we've seen stuff that has happened to Gary Fettke, to like all of these, Tim Noakes, all these people who have tried to go ahead of the guidelines. It's just not easy. There's no easy choice to make here.
Yeah, I can see that.
Okay, so I want to talk about, get back to talking specifically about heart disease. So we know that kind of what started this for us in terms of, heart disease was people would have a heart attack, they would do an autopsy, they would look at the arteries are clogged with something, they would test what it was clogged with. Oh, it's clogged with cholesterol. Oh, cholesterol must be bad. What is causing those plaques, and what is it that we can do to lower, let's just start with that. What's causing those plaques, and what are those plaques trying to do? What are those plaques trying to do?
This is something I've been trying to figure out for over a year now, because there is the cholesterol thing, and essentially a leading theory is that LDL particles get into the artery, they oxidize. Once they're oxidized, immune cells will see them, they'll eat them, and then we have these foam cells, which essentially they're just immune cells that are stuffed full of cholesterol, because from what I understand, the immune cells can't break down the cholesterol, so they have to hand it off to HDL, for example, for it to be recycled or thrown out. So if that's actually true, I don't know. Like, I know parts of it are true. We do have good evidence that immune cells do in fact eat damaged LDL. They do in fact turn into foam cells. Like, that's pretty well established. But where LDL is getting oxidized, that's the question that I've been kind of pondering over for quite a while with Dave. Because there is like some pretty good evidence that they could be oxidized in the bloodstream. For example, if you smoke a lot, for example, then there will be things called reactive oxygen species, and these will oxidize things. And LDL, in fact, carries antioxidants on it, the fat-based antioxidants, particularly vitamin E, that can be used as an antioxidant. And I have seen it speculated in a paper that LDL could be being used as another source of antioxidants during infection. So then the question of that is, maybe it's not only during infection. Maybe this is just part of its job. In which case, a case of what is causing these plaques and this foam cell buildup could be LDL getting oxidized in the bloodstream, and then like you would pull over a car with a broken taillight, it's pulled off to the side, and then the immune cells take care of it because, frankly, it's dangerous to have around otherwise, because these LDL particles that have been massively oxidized, they can cause chain reaction oxidation. And while they do have some defenses against that by getting rid of the damaged pieces, after a certain point, you're going to have to do something and take care of it. And part of that is the immune cell's job. They do that all the time for even beyond LDL particles, just normal cells that have been damaged, they clear them out. So that wouldn't be surprising to me. But the interesting part for me is those plaques aren't even where it starts. Like far before we see the plaques accumulating, like that's talked about as the initiating thing for heart disease. But there's some evidence that no, there are things going on way before that, like arterial thickening. It's called arterial hyperplasia, I think. Essentially, it just means thickening, excess growth. And one of the things that can cause the thickening of that type is damage to the arteries. It'll grow in response. We can see that in kids who get really severe infections, their arterial thickness goes up afterwards. But it's not just infection. Anything that damages the arteries, I would suspect, would be doing the same thing. And so this is happening far, far before any of this plaque deposition and stuff like that. And as far as the calcified plaques, I read a paper quite some time back, I don't remember exactly when, that was talking about that as protective. Because essentially this is just like reinforcing the arteries.
Right.
If the arteries get damaged to the point where they are essentially turning to sludge, that's not a technical term, but if they're disintegrating and they can't keep their normal function anymore, I mean, at that point, you could argue that having calcification there to reinforce it and just keep it functioning for a little while longer is better than the alternative. Mm-hmm. I mean, I can see that making sense, and granted, it's one paper talking about that, but I mean, the mechanisms are there to back it up. So
what is it about the thick arteries that seem to be more prone to these plaques and everything? Why don't we see plaques in the smaller capillaries or the smaller parts of the body? Why is it these main arteries that feed the heart that seem to be where these plaques typically show up?
I mean, I've seen some argumentation that it could just be because they're more exposed to damage. The capillaries, there's not a whole lot of force going on there where damage could occur, but also the arteries are just getting a lot of traffic. So anything that's damaging, it's going to hit the arteries. And capillaries do not have, I mean, as far as I'm aware, they don't have what are called scavenger receptors, which is essentially just little garbage dump detectors that will pull out damaged bits. And that may be where that first plaque deposition is coming from, is just damaged LDL getting pulled out and dealt with. And we can even see other things that would be dealt with by those scavenger receptors in the plaque. For example, there's certain bacteria that can be found there. So I think part of it is just the high traffic area. Part of it is probably also just that they're more exposed to damage. I haven't explored that too deeply, so I'm sure someone else has a better answer. But yeah, as far as I understand it, it's complicated.
So I'm going to do one thing. I'm going to ask you a question, and then I'm going to go let my dog in because she's outside and just screaming. And I don't know what her problem is, but I want to talk specifically about the Feldman protocol because I'm fascinated by this, and I think it's an idea that low carbers need to know about, and they need to know what's going on there. So can you explain what the Feldman protocol is and what that's doing for us?
Yeah. So the Feldman protocol is essentially a self-experiment that pretty much anybody can do. So it's a low-calorie or fasting phase, and then it's a high-calorie ketogenic phase. And essentially what you're doing is you're changing how your body's taking in energy. So for the low-calorie or fasting phase, you are forcing your body to use body fat stores because food's not coming in anywhere else, not in sufficient quantities. So what that does is it's possibly increasing VLDL coming into the bloodstream to transport that energy, and as a result, your LDL goes up, like way up. But then you do the high-calorie phase, and you're taking in lots and lots of energy from food, and that's transported in a different particle than VLDL, and these two particles are counterbalancing each other essentially. So the more you're getting from dietary fat, the less you have to supplement from just body fat, and so your LDL tanks. I've done this on 3 separate occasions. The first one was a 6-day protocol where it was 3 days low calorie or fasting and 3 days high fat, high calorie. That was back at Keto Fest 2017. And then just recently I did a 12.5-day Feldman protocol. Normally it's 10.5, but my nearby LabCorp wasn't open on weekends, so I had to extend the fasting phase from 5 days to 7 days. And then I did 5 days of high calorie and high fat. And that had pretty good results. What I found with that one, I think my LDL-C dropped by like 150 milligrams per deciliter in the space of like 5 days, which is not supposed to happen by common medical standards, but it does.
Because your cholesterol is supposed to stay roughly the same, right? It's supposed to be pretty normal.
Usually they'll say it'll take like 6 months or something for it to change. And granted, like for people who are changing diet, typically things tend to be kind of really weird for like the first 4 months or so. So I think that's kind of fair. But if you just want to manipulate yourself, all it takes is a couple days. And then I did another one where I did 5 days of just baseline calories and then 5 days of really, really high calorie, high fat, where it was at one point I was eating like 6,000 calories a day for the last 2 days. And I think it was around, I want to say like 500 grams of fat, so about a pound, all from heavy cream, so it was easy. Right. But the reason that I wanted to do that was because for the 12.5-day protocol where I had 7 days of fasting, what I actually found was that my lipoprotein(a) went higher than it normally does. And then during the high calorie, high fat phase, it tanked to the lowest level I had ever seen. And this is another marker that is supposed to be genetically determined. It doesn't change. You can't change it with diet. Really, there's only 1 or 2 drugs that can really change it to any significant degree. And even then, it's maybe like 30 to 50%, like not huge. So I was fascinated by that because it seemed like it had been following the inversion pattern, the same one that LDL-C and LDL-P follow, which is low calorie, low fat, it goes up, high calorie, high fat, it goes down, and it's following this energy distribution system. But the thing with lipoprotein(a) is it's, as far as I'm aware, it's not an energy distribution type of thing. Mostly what it has to do with is wound repair. You'll find it in the arteries if there's injury there, for example, and it has some cleanup processes with oxidized phospholipid, so the oxidized shell and membrane. So that was kind of interesting, and one person had said that there was a possibility that the fasting beforehand had messed with it because there's this kind of cleanup during fasting and then there's a regrowth period, so maybe it was being used for one of those and that's why it went lower. So with the baseline calories, I was able to rule that out, and I was able to confirm that, nope, this appears to be following the inversion pattern just like LDL-C, which means it's far more dynamic than we originally thought. And granted, before this, I had also done testing while I was sick, which I mean, it would be great if other people could if they wanted to, but it's actually a pain. But I had gotten blood work done while sick. Yeah, because you have to get sick and you have to crawl out of bed and go to the LabCorp and get the blood drawn, and they look at you weird. But I had also seen that lipoprotein(a) appeared to be following C-reactive protein, which is an inflammation marker, when I was sick. But if my C-reactive protein was pretty steady, there are other things that could have been influencing the lipoprotein(a). So it seems to be multiple things that are influencing its levels. And one of the things that I'm wondering now, after confirming that it does appear to be following this inversion pattern, is if there could be such a thing as like a lipoprotein(a) hyper-responder, because we see that sometimes with LDL-C, where it'll go super high on someone who's on a low-carb diet because of this energy thing. And if lipoprotein(a) is being influenced by the energy system directly or just by LDLP production, who knows, then it could be, if I go back to a high-carb, low-fat diet, then it may go down to normal levels. I have no idea. This is something I want to test out. But, I mean, I haven't seen it mentioned, really, about people getting their lipoprotein(a) tested and then they go keto and it goes super high. I just haven't heard that. But granted, not a lot of people get it tested anyway, so it could very well be a part of it. But, yeah, so I might have to replicate Dave's carb swap experiment at some point, which is not going to be fun. But I will not be doing bread. Thank you very much. I'll probably do something like sweet potatoes and lean meat, because no thanks.
Have you seen a difference in the cholesterol profiles of people depending on the type of fat they eat? So saturated fat versus monounsaturated versus polyunsaturated. Does that change their cholesterol profile?
Yeah, there's actually someone who did this just testing full out, and I have seen anecdotes of people switching to monosaturated fat and their cholesterol went down sometimes. But Chris Bear of Keto Chow actually did an experiment where he was just straight up drinking Keto Chow. So the only thing that was changing was the type of fat he was using. And he did a whole bunch of them. I think he did avocado oil, he did heavy cream, which is mostly saturated fat. Avocado would have been mostly mono, and then he did one that was high in PUFA, and he did see a change in his lipid profile. And he actually saw a really weird change with the monounsaturated fat, and if I remember, he was able to replicate it, but it didn't do the same thing for anyone else in his family. So it's definitely an influence. George Henderson has also talked about saturated fat changing LDL and the mechanisms behind this, and it seems to be just kind of, that can sometimes be how it goes. But again, I mean, the argument for that is it beneficial to then switch to monounsaturated fat?
Right.
I don't know. I mean, me personally, I stick to saturated fat. Dave does the same. I mean, if I'm going to be a guinea pig, I can guinea pig that happily.
Okay. Speaking of guinea pig, you said you've been a carnivore for the last year or so. How has that changed your health? How has that changed your blood markers, or has it?
I mean, surprisingly, not much has changed. I was actually super excited to go into it. I had started carnivore after I had seen Amber O'Hearn's talk at Keto Fest 2017. It seems to be like a keystone moment. And I mean, going off of her presentation, I was like, okay, maybe I don't need so many vegetables. I'll only eat the ones that I really like. And over the course of Keto Fest up to October, I was slowly getting rid of more and more vegetables, mostly because I was lazy and didn't want to prepare them. And also partially because I wanted more time to study, and meat is faster to cook than pretty much anything else. So going into October, I was at work and I wanted something to think about experiment-wise, because I needed to keep my brain busy while I was on hold for a call or whatever else. And so I talked to Dave and I was like, I think I'm going to do carnivore. He was like, all right, sure. He already had it on his roster to do, but he's got like 10 bajillion other things to do. So it wasn't a huge deal. And unfortunately, I didn't get baseline blood work right before I started, because I just started right into it without thinking about it. But I did have blood work back from July where I was still eating omnivorous keto. And comparing then to now, I mean, not really much has changed. My cholesterol has gone up a little bit, but I would guess that's actually more to do with I lost about 20 pounds going from keto to carnivore. My C-reactive protein has gone down by like half. It used to be 1 and now it's usually like 0.5 or something.
Mhm.
And like I said before, that's just an inflammation marker. So it went from low to really, really low. Yeah, beyond that, I haven't noticed much of a change. I was hoping HDL would go up because mine tends to run pretty low, like in the 40s, mid 40s to upper 40s, but it hasn't really. I do have some guesses on why that is now, because when I did the keto chow for this most recent Feldman protocol attempt, my HDL went up above baseline, and then for the high calorie, it went up again. So yeah, I suspect it was something in the keto chow that caused that. For example, there is some research to suggest that impaired folate metabolism can mess with HDL levels. And I have, I'm compound heterozygous, which just means I have one gene each for the two polymorphisms for MTHFR, which can impair folate metabolism and methylation. And the keto chow has methylated B vitamins in it, which includes methylfolate. So it could just be that I'm running low on folate because of that methylation issue, and that's causing the low HDL. I'm actually going to be verifying this. I'm going to go on methylated B vitamins in next month, early next month, and I'll be getting baseline blood work and follow-up to see if it shifts HDL. Because HDL, I mean, I haven't been concerned about it because it's kind of been in the same range forever. So there was no sudden drop for me to be concerned about. It was just kind of an anomaly that I had noticed, and everything else looked fine. So it's kind of like a stain on a wall that's kind of always been there. Hasn't been growing, hasn't been getting worse. It's just kind of something you look at every now and again and go, I wonder what caused that. But hopefully I'll find out soon, because that would be pretty interesting, actually. So that was a very roundabout answer.
No, that's great. I mean, I tried carnivore for, I think, I want to say a month. And turns out I just really like vegetables. And my wife didn't like the fact that I was eating all the meat and not leaving any. I was giving her a lot of vegetables, a little meat, and I was eating all the meat, and she wasn't a big fan of that. What were you, Diane?
He was eating steak every night and giving me like chicken or whatever, and I was like, I wanted the steak. And he was like, no, those are for me.
Oh, that's rough. That's rough. You can't do that.
That's exactly right.
No, I actually found that I've been enjoying it. I went into it thinking it was going to be this temporary, like maybe 1 month, 3-month experiment. And I found that it freed up so much free time, which is fantastic when I was technically kind of working 2 jobs at the time, where I was working the IT job, but also helping out Dave on the side. And like being able to have a meal that takes like 5 minutes of hands-on time to shove things in the oven and then 15 minutes to eat, compared to like an hour before, like right. No chance I was going back from there. And then exactly. My hair improved. Like it used to be much more frizzy, and now it's kind of like that shiny, glossy type of thing that I've always wanted. I mean, I lost weight, which is, I'm not going to complain about that. My appetite has been good, and here's a weird thing I don't usually mention because it sounds kind of woo, but I had an issue when I was on the standard American diet and on keto, where people would always talk about food like it was, I mean, delicious, like, oh, this is fantastic, this is the best thing ever, and they were obviously finding the food pleasurable. But I never found that happening for me. Like, not once. I would eat food and I would be like, this tastes fine. I could tell it objectively tasted good, but there was no like, oh, this is so good. This is so good. But then when I went carnivore, I realized I was actually enjoying food. I was getting excited to eat. I was happy when I was eating. I was thinking, I'm really glad I'm having this. This is exactly what I wanted. This is fantastic. And at one point while I was eating, I actually got goosebumps because I was enjoying it so much. And I've actually gone back to ketogenic food. And it's the same exact thing all over again. Objectively, tastes fine. Do I enjoy it? No. So it's like, why am I even eating this stuff when it does nothing for me? I have no idea what causes that. Maybe it's just in my head. I don't know. But I mean, it's one thing I'm not willing to trade in until I have good reason to do so, because like actually enjoying food is like, I didn't know that could happen.
That's because I'm interested in that joy aspect, that that dopamine dump that you get from certain foods, and I'm curious about people who are just really, really addicted to sugar and carbohydrates and things like that. Some people just have a really, really hard time cutting those out of their life. And I'm wondering if they are, we'll use your term, hyper responders to the dopamine that you get from increased sugar consumption, because I've known people that they get so much pleasure from sugar. The idea of just doing without it is too much. So that relationship between joy and our food, our diet, is there's probably a lot more there that needs to be looked at.
Yeah, I would agree. And I mean, I definitely do think people can get addicted to sugar. And hey, if that came with absolutely no repercussions, I would say go for it. But in my case, it definitely does. And the interesting thing with me for the meat is it doesn't seem to be an addiction thing, because that's one of the things that was brought up when I had sort of mentioned it in passing before, is maybe you're just addicted. It's like, okay, but when I'm not hungry, I'm not thinking about the food. When I'm eating the food, I only eat until full and then I don't want any more. Like, I know what addiction feels like, because I had that with diet soda, which I've now kicked. Hooray. I had that with sugar. And even with the sugar, even though there was no pleasure, it was almost like a numbing effect. It's not even comparable, because the addiction behavior is not there for me, even though I had that with sugar without the pleasure. And that could have just been because, I like blew out the pleasure circuit in my brain, was just unable to feel anything.
and that may be there. I mean, I'm wondering if there are people that have just flooded their brain with so much dopamine that they just don't really process it too much.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. But like, the good news is, like, if you are concerned about your health and you are addicted to sugar, like, one of my friends used to be heavy duty sugar addict, like everyday Starbucks sweetened drinks, like all that type of stuff. And I had her go keto because she got interested in it, hearing it from me. And within 2 weeks, she said the cravings were completely gone. Even though she used to be a sugar addict, like, they do go away. Mm-hmm. Even as impossible as it sounds, they go away, and they don't usually come back. And even if they do come back, it's so easier to handle. It's not even funny.
I wonder if at least part of that is that when you go keto, you're nourishing your body in a way it hasn't been nourished in a while, and so your body feels like it's getting fed. There's probably something to that as well.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
So I'm going to bring Diane back in. Diane, do you have any last questions before we call it an interview?
No, I think I'm good.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, Siobhan, can you tell us where you can be found, how people can get to know you, what's going on with you, and how they can follow you and find out all about these experiments that you're doing?
Sure. So the number one place to find me is cholesterolcode.com. Just post a comment. You can specify you're looking for me. I'll come find you. I check there most frequently. And number two would be Twitter. I'm Siobhan_Huggins. I'm hoping you'll have a link because people won't be able to spell it. Yeah. I'm also on Instagram, where I mostly just post about cats and knitting. And that is at RightHandSiobhan. And I'll be at Low Carb Houston pretty soon. And I'll also be at the Boulder Carnivore Conference. I'll be speaking there. And then I'll be attending Low Carb Denver directly after as a guest.
I did not know that there was a carnivore conference. That's interesting.
There is. Carnivorecon.com.
Carnivorecon.com. All right. Well, Siobhan, thank you so much for coming on the show. I appreciate everything you had to say, and you've been a font of information.
Yeah, happy to be on. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. So those of you listening, hold on. We'll be right back with some more information.